In response to reports of a potential U.S. travel ban on Communist Party members, Beijing said on Friday that any such travel ban would mean Washington stands against the entire Chinese population. But the Chinese people took to social media to say they disagree.
China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson called Washington's potential travel ban against China's ruling Communist Party absurd and said it's against the will of the Chinese and American people. News about the ban provoked heated discussion on China's social media, but most seem to disagree with their spokesperson. A state media account posted the news on the Chinese counterpart of Twitter, Weibo. However, the comments below mostly support the idea of the ban. The most liked comment reads, "This is powerful," indicating the travel ban, and asked Washington, "Please do what you said and don't back down." Other comments include, "This is the best thing the United States has ever done," and "Wow, I guess no ordinary Chinese people would oppose this policy." Some even tagged the account of the U.S. Embassy in China and said, "Please do enforce this." Multiple media reported that the Trump administration is considering banning entry of all Communist Party members, Chinese military personnel, and executives of state-owned companies. NTD's sister media, the Epoch Times China editor Annie Wu said one of the reasons the Chinese people are supporting the ban is they know that the corrupt officials in China will suffer most from it.
Yes, it's quite ironic, but there has been a pattern of Chinese officials transferring their assets overseas with the political instability inside China. Also, the economic downturn over the past decade, many officials have moved their children and their families overseas, and usually the hope is that the official will then join the family later and their assets will be safer.
That's why some said by issuing the ban, the U.S. would be helping China with its anti-corruption campaign. One comment called President Trump the head of Anti-Corruption Bureau. Another called him an anti-corruption hero and said we need to rely on the United States for our anti-corruption movement.
I think a large part of the Chinese people are pretty disillusioned with the party ruling. They know that a lot of officials are corrupt, and that's why they've decided to move their assets overseas. So for the ordinary Chinese people who don't have the financial means to move abroad, I think this kind of announcement is kind of funny to them, that the high-level officials end up perhaps being in a bit of trouble there.
U.S. immigration law forbid members of the Communist Party or other totalitarian or terrorist organizations to become U.S. citizens. During the Cold War, communists can't even enter the country, but the U.S. loosened the restriction in the 1990s. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
And a group in Liechtenstein is pushing for a law that would crack down on human rights violators. The law would deny entry into the country for foreign officials who are involved in human rights abuses.
A group of people gathered to rally in Liechtenstein, a small European country between Austria and Switzerland. The event was held to call for lawmakers' support on a human rights law dubbed the Magninsky Act. If passed, the law would prevent people who have committed serious human rights violations, like persecuting people of faith, from entering the country. It would also allow their assets to be frozen. The United States passed and signed the Magninsky Act into law in 2012 after Russian officials allegedly tortured a tax consultant to death in prison. Now the rally's organizers say it's important for Liechtenstein to follow America's lead.
We want Liechtenstein to follow the good example of the USA and implement the Magnitsky Act. That's why I will submit an appeal to the head of government of Liechtenstein.
The gathering was organized and supported by Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong, also called Falun Dafa, is a spiritual meditation practice based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Though it was introduced to the public in China back in 1992, the Chinese regime now brutally persecutes those who practice it, as well as those of other spiritual or religious backgrounds. The rally's organizers are now appealing to lawmakers in hopes they'll implement the act, which would penalize the very officials who enable the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Liechtenstein is known for using its low corporate tax rates to draw in companies from all over the world. That's how the small country became one of the wealthiest worldwide, relative to its purchasing power. The rally's organizer added that it was especially important to implement the law because of the country's strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP.
Especially in Liechtenstein, it is important that the law is implemented because of the large sums of money flowing into Liechtenstein from CCP officials.
The country's heads of state have received the appeal to implement the law. Liechtenstein's parliament is currently on summer break. Talks will continue when officials return in the fall. NTD, Liechtenstein.
A transnational criminal organization. That's what a human rights committee is urging the U.S. Department of Justice to designate the Chinese Communist Party. The committee says it's time to get bold in calling out the CCP's criminal activity. NTD's Melina Weisskopf spoke to the human rights attorney who drafted the letter to find out what they hope to accomplish.
The United States continues cracking down hard on the Chinese Communist Party. U.S. officials like the Attorney General William Barr, the FBI Director, and the National Security Advisor are laying bare what Barr calls predatory and unlawful tactics of the CCP. The Committee on the Present Danger, China, sent an open letter to the Attorney General requesting that the United States designate the CCP as a transnational criminal organization.
And I think it's absolutely critical that they be called out for what they are. And so I went about conducting legal research on the CCP, their criminal activity here in the United States, and what laws we could use to provide sanctions, provide prosecution.
Examples of criminal activity include stealing American sensitive information through multiple IP hacks. And it goes even further than privacy breaches. The CCP has killed hundreds of thousands of its own citizens through an ongoing brutal persecution of Christians, Uyghurs, practitioners of Falun Gong, and others. The regime also has American deaths to answer for. Chinese sources have been shipping tons of opioids into the U.S., which have killed thousands.
We know that fentanyl originates in China. It's being transferred from China through the Postal Service into the United States.
And most recently, the CCP's cover-up of the virus's human-to-human transmission caused the deaths of 140,000 Americans and counting.
If America takes the lead on this, you will see other countries also follow, because other countries have lost tens and hundreds of thousands of their citizens as a result of what we call the CCP virus.
If the U.S. does label the CCP as a transnational criminal organization, the U.S. could apply more criminal sanctions, freeze financial assets, and set up teams of investigators to track and put an end to the CCP's criminal conduct. Yor says she urges American citizens to use the power of their voices and sign the open letter to stop the CCP's inhumane practices. Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
Beijing passing the controversial national security law in Hong Kong prompted Britain to offer up to 3 million Hong Kongers the right to live and work in the UK. Beijing says this amounts to gross interference. NTD reporter Jane Werrell asked people in the UK their thoughts about it.
The controversial national security law in Hong Kong cracks down on protesters and gives sweeping powers to the Chinese Communist Party. The US, the UK and other countries have condemned it.
It violates Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and is in direct conflict with Hong Kong basic law.
Boris Johnson has offered a route to citizenship to Hong Kongers. Up to 3 million Hong Kong citizens are eligible to live and work in the UK and after 5 years apply for citizenship. Foreign Office sources told The Telegraph that a fraction of them, an estimated 200,000 people, are likely to take up the offer. Nathan Law, a prominent activist in Hong Kong, fled to London this week. The Chinese regime has warned there will be consequences for the UK's offer of visa rights to Hong Kongers, but has not detailed what those consequences would be.
The UK must bear the consequences that will arise from this.
But what do people in the UK think? A YouGov survey shows that 64% of Brits support giving British passport holders in Hong Kong a permanent right to live in the UK, with a similar view across Conservative and Labour voters. A lot of people we asked were unaware of the new law being passed in Hong Kong, but more had heard of the offer of visa rights.
For the Hong Kong citizens, it's really good, and I agree with the measure. Sure. I don't know how this will play with the government's stance on immigration, because up until now they want to reduce it as much as possible, and this has the potential to increase it heavily, right?
Over the next 2 years, you'll probably find that many people in Hong Kong, maybe half of them, who knows, will emigrate to places like Britain or the United States. Yeah, I think the Chinese authorities are going to clamp down on any freedom of speech.
I think people would hesitate to go to Hong Kong because of this law, for sure. I myself as well.
I don't feel sorry for them. If it happened in London or our country, I would hope everyone would fight it, because it just cannot be forced to do what you don't want to do.
Yeah, they've experienced a level of free speech for so long, so to suddenly have that curtailed, I think is going to be a real issue for them.
Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.